On the edge of the Nevada desert, silence can be a killer. For war veteran Jack Turner, a rusty shipping container was supposed to be his fortress against the ghosts of battle. But when his loyal German Shepherd scout dug up a secret buried near Sparrow Creek, Jack realized the desert was hiding something far darker than his memories. A truth that connects a girl's disappearance in 1978. A locket that hums at night and whispers from beyond the stars. What Scout found was not just a relic. It was the beginning of everything. Chapter 1. A New Beginning. The Nevada desert woke slowly each morning, as though reluctant to release the cool embrace of night before surrendering to the merciless sun. Pale streaks of pink and gold stretched across the horizon, painting the mountains with a glow that lasted only a few minutes before fading into the flat, punishing light of day. For Jack Turner, these early hours were the only time the desert seemed soft, a place where silence was not threatening, but protective, wrapping him in a fragile calm. He stood at the doorway of the old shipping container that had become his home, a chipped mug of coffee warming his scarred hands. Scout, his loyal German Shepherd, stretched beside him with a grunt, amber eyes flicking toward Maggie Hart's ranch in the distance. Maggie was no longer just a neighbor. Months of storms, shared work, and quiet understanding had drawn her into his world. What had begun as cautious nods from across fence lines had grown into something far deeper, an intimacy without the need for many words. Maggie's presence carried a steadiness Jack had not known he needed until she was there. She had moved into his life gradually, like water filling the cracks of dry earth, until one morning he realized that they were no longer two solitary figures surviving side by side, but a pair, stitched together by resilience and unspoken trust. Their lives had settled into a rhythm, tending Maggie's cattle, repairing equipment, cooking simple meals, and taking Scout on long patrols through the scrubland. The desert, once a fortress Jack built against the world, had shifted in meaning. It was still harsh, still unforgiving, but with Maggie, it felt less like exile and more like a place where something new might grow. Yet even in the stillness of their companionship, shadows lingered. At night Jack still woke, drenched in sweat, heart pounding from dreams of mortar fire and burning Humvees. Sometimes Maggie would find him sitting outside beneath the stars, shoulders rigid, staring into the distance as though expecting an enemy patrol to appear over the ridge. She never forced words from him in those moments. She simply sat nearby, sometimes resting a hand on his back, sometimes saying nothing at all. It was that silence, gentle, not oppressive, that began to change him. But Maggie carried her own grief. The locket Jack had returned to her, engraved with Amy, Aug 1978, had stirred wounds she had buried for decades. Amy, her cousin, had vanished under strange and painful circumstances, leaving behind a void Maggie learned to mask with work and stoicism. When Jack noticed her staring at the locket for long minutes by the firelight, eyes glassy with unshed tears, he recognized her pain mirrored his own. They were both people who had survived by building walls, yet fate had placed them side by side in this desert, giving them a chance to lower those walls together. It was Maggie who stumbled upon the book that shifted everything. One windy afternoon, while running errands in the dusty town of Fallon, she wandered into a second-hand shop tucked between a hardware store and a closed diner. The place smelled of old paper and cedar. There, on a crooked shelf, lay a slim volume with a faded cover, Peace is Every Step, by Thich Nhat Hanh. She had no idea why her fingers lingered on it, but something in the title spoke directly to the raw ache in her chest. She bought it for a few dollars and tucked it into her bag. That night, as the desert winds howled outside, Maggie sat by the small propane lamp in Jack's container and began reading aloud. Jack, sharpening a tool, listened with half an ear until a line caught him. Breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I smile, dwelling in the present moment. I know this is a wonderful moment. He froze, knife in hand, the words pulling at something in him. A wonderful moment? For years, every moment had felt like a battlefield replay. Yet here was a voice, calm and unwavering, suggesting that peace could be as simple as a breath. Maggie noticed his stillness. She looked up and asked softly, "Want me to read more?" Jack nodded. From then on, their evenings took on a new ritual. Maggie would read passages from the book, while Jack listened, at first with skepticism, then with a growing hunger. The teachings spoke of letting go, of mindfulness, of finding freedom not by running from suffering, but by sitting with it, understanding it. Scout often lay at their feet, tail thumping in the quiet, as though sensing the weight of the moment. Soon they began to practice. Tentative at first, Maggie suggested they sit together, close their eyes, and follow the instructions. Breathe in, follow the breath. Breathe out, let go. Jack struggled, his mind always leaping to gunfire and desert sands far away. But Maggie's hand resting lightly on his knee was enough to draw him back. Sometimes he growled in frustration, muttering, "I can't stop the noise in my head." Maggie would smile gently and answer, "Then don't stop it. Just notice it. The book says even noticing is already peace." The desert became their teacher. In the silence of dawn, they tried walking meditation, placing each step carefully, aware of the crunch of sand beneath their boots. Scout padded along, ears perked, as if joining their silent ritual. Maggie felt the dry wind on her cheeks, and for the first time, instead of thinking about loss, she thought only of the simple joy of standing there, alive, with Jack and Scout. Jack, meanwhile, felt something shift inside him. For brief moments, the ghosts of war grew quieter. Yet the journey was not smooth. Jack had nights when rage spilled over, when his voice rose and his hands trembled, old traumas clawing their way back. Maggie had evenings when she clutched to Amy's locket, shoulders shaking, unable to bear the weight of memory. But now, instead of retreating into silence, they tried something new. They sat together, breathing, sometimes crying, sometimes saying nothing. Slowly, painfully, the desert fortress they had each built began to open into a sanctuary. One morning, Jack admitted something that surprised even him. "When you read from that book, I feel like maybe I'm not broken. Maybe I'm just carrying too much." His voice cracked. Maggie reached out and squeezed his hand. "Then let's carry it together, and maybe learn to set some of it down." As the sun rose higher, burning the horizon, Jack felt a strange stirring. For years he had sought silence to bury his pain. Now with Maggie's steady presence and the words of a Vietnamese monk echoing in his heart, he began to see silence not as a coffin of steel, but as an opening, a path. It was the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. But it was real, and it was theirs. The desert had a way of stretching time. Days felt endless under the white-hot sun, and nights seemed to last forever, with only the hiss of wind breaking the silence. But inside Jack's container home, the rhythm of life was beginning to change. The presence of the thin paperback Maggie had found, "Peace is every step," was reshaping their evenings and mornings, offering a kind of structure that neither of them had expected. They read the book so slowly, almost reverently, as if each sentence carried weight. Maggie, her voice low and deliberate, would read a passage, and then silence would follow. Sometimes Jack would frown, chewing on the words like a soldier testing rations for poison. Other times, his shoulders would soften, the tightness in his jaw easing, as though the words had unlocked something he had kept sealed for years. One evening Maggie read aloud, "When we are mindful, deeply in touch with the present moment, our understanding of what is going on deepens, and we begin to be filled with acceptance, joy, peace, and love." Jack shifted uneasily, staring at the rough floor. "Acceptance," he muttered. "Easy to say when you haven't been there, when you haven't seen." He trailed off, but Maggie knew where the words were heading, toward the war, toward those memories that still bled into his dreams. "Maybe," she said gently, "but what if he's right? What if acceptance isn't about agreeing with what happened, but letting it be part of us without destroying us?" Jack glanced at her, eyes narrowing, then softening. He wanted to dismiss it, to shove it away, but something inside him clung to the thought. What if peace was not about erasing the past, but learning to live with it? That night they tried a new practice. Maggie read the simple instructions. Sit comfortably. Follow your breath. Breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I smile. They sat cross-legged on the floor, Scout lying down between them, his steady breathing oddly comforting. Jack struggled immediately. His mind darted from image to image, the flash of explosions, the cries of soldiers, the stench of diesel and blood. He clenched his fists, chest tightening. Maggie noticed. She placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Don't fight it," she whispered. "Just notice it, then come back to the breath." Her words were like a lifeline. Jack inhaled, shaky at first, then steadier. For a moment, just a moment, he felt himself not in a battlefield, not even in the desert, but simply there, breathing. The ghosts did not vanish, but they stepped back, no longer pressing against his chest. He opened his eyes and looked at Maggie. She smiled softly, and the simple curve of her lips held more power than any sermon. He found himself smiling back, though his was smaller, hesitant, like a child relearning an old skill. Over the next weeks they kept practicing. Mornings began with silent sitting, even if only for 5 minutes. At first, Jack resisted. What's the point of just sitting here? But he started to notice subtle changes. His hands trembled less during breakfast. His heart didn't pound as wildly when Scout barked at sudden noises. Maggie, too, felt lighter. The ache of Amy's absence did not disappear, but it no longer felt like an open wound. Instead, it became something she could touch gently, without breaking apart. They also began keeping meditation journals. Maggie wrote about moments of calm, about gratitude for the desert's vastness, about the feel of Scout's fur under her hand. Jack's entries were rougher, sometimes only a few words. Didn't sleep, breathed anyway. Or, nightmare? Maggie's voice helped, but each word marked progress. A soldier's log not of battles fought outside, but within. Still, the practice tested them. Jack had days when anger boiled over, when he slammed tools on the table, growling that this mindful breathing was useless against the war still raging in his head. Maggie had nights when the loneliness of losing Amy overwhelmed her, when she clutched the locket and sobbed. But instead of turning away, they began turning toward each other, breathing together, sitting in silence, sometimes crying side by side. The desert bore witness to their transformation. On long walks with Scout, They practiced walking meditation. Each step was slow, deliberate. Jack had always walked like a soldier, scanning the horizon, ready for threat. Now he tried walking simply to walk, feeling the crunch of gravel, the shifting of sand beneath his boots. Maggie whispered the words she had read. "I have arrived. I am home." At first, Jack scoffed, but after a while the words settled into his chest. For the first time in years, he wondered if he really could feel at home, in his body, in the world, in this desert. One afternoon, after a long session of reading and breathing, Jack admitted something he hadn't dared say aloud. "When you read to me, when we sit like that, it feels like maybe I'm not just surviving anymore." He swallowed, eyes flicking to hers. "It feels like I could actually live again." Maggie reached out, taking his calloused hand in hers. "That's all I want," she said, "for both of us, to live, not just endure." Scout barked once, as if in agreement, then flopped onto his back, paws in the air. They laughed, the sound echoing across the container walls, bright and free. That night, the desert sky stretched wide and glittering above them. For years, Jack had seen the stars as cold, indifferent points in a vast void. But now, sitting beside Maggie and Scout, he felt them differently, like distant lights, reminding him that peace was not impossible, that perhaps with patience and breath, even the most wounded heart could learn to shine again. Chapter 3. Learning to Let Go. The Nevada desert was merciless in summer. Even in the morning, heat shimmered over the sand and sagebrush, distorting the horizon into a wavering mirage. Jack Turner walked slowly across the open land, with Scout trotting at his side. Each step sank slightly into the dry soil, and the crunch of gravel under his boots reminded him of military patrols long ago. Except now he was not carrying a rifle, only a battered canteen. Still his shoulders were tense, eyes scanning the horizon, as if waiting for danger. When he reached the small ridge overlooking Maggie Hart's ranch, he sat on a rock, breathing heavily. Scout lay beside him, panting. Jack pressed his hands against his knees and closed his eyes. Maggie's voice echoed in his memory, steady and clear. "Don't fight it. Just notice it. Then breathe." He inhaled slowly, the dry desert air stinging his lungs. For the first time he tried not to shove the memories away. He let them come. The blast of an IED, the weight of a wounded soldier in his arms, the metallic scent of blood. His heart pounded, but he didn't push the images down. He just breathed. After several minutes, the storm inside his chest eased slightly. When he opened his eyes, the desert looked the same, but he felt different. Not healed, not whole, but perhaps less imprisoned. For years he had believed survival meant burying his past. Now he wondered if survival meant letting the past exist without letting it control him. Back at the container, Maggie was working by the small makeshift table they used for meals. She was writing in her journal. The thin book Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings had inspired them to keep. Her dark hair, tied back in a loose braid, shimmered in the sunlight that streamed through the small window Jack had cut into the container wall. She looked up when he entered, smiling faintly. "You were gone a while," she said. "Yeah," Jack muttered, setting down his canteen. Tried just letting it be there, the memories. Didn't run from them. Maggie's smile grew, though her eyes softened with compassion. "And?" He exhaled. "Hard. But maybe it didn't kill me to sit with them." "That's progress," Maggie said. She reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on his. Jack didn't pull away. Later that evening they sat together, Maggie with Amy's locket in her hand. She turned it over slowly, the engraved A catching the light. Her voice was quiet, almost trembling. For so long, I couldn't even think her name without breaking. I pretended she was just gone, but I never really accepted it. Maybe. She looked at Jack, eyes glistening. Maybe it's time I did. Jack nodded, understanding more than words could express. Acceptance doesn't mean forgetting. No, Maggie whispered. It means she can live in me without destroying me. That night, instead of reading from the book, they created their own practice. They lit a candle and placed the locket beside it. They sat in silence, breathing. Maggie let tears fall freely, but she didn't turn away. Jack placed his hand over hers, grounding her as she faced the grief she had carried for decades. For Jack, this was a revelation. In the military, pain was something to be ignored or conquered. Here, in the quiet of the desert, with Maggie's hand in his, pain became something to embrace, to soften, to let go. The act of sitting with suffering, his own and Maggie's, became an unspoken vow between them. The following days, their practice deepened. They continued journaling, not only about struggles, but about gratitude. Maggie wrote about Scout's quiet loyalty, about the way the desert glowed at sunrise. Jack's entries were short but meaningful, held her hand while she cried, didn't feel powerless. Or, nightmare again, but I breathed. It passed. Each line was evidence of transformation. Scout, ever the silent witness, became part of the ritual. He often sat at their feet during meditation, his steady breathing reminding them of the natural rhythm of life. Sometimes Jack joked, maybe Scout's the real monk here. Maggie would laugh, and in that laughter, a bit more of their pain dissolved. But the journey was not without obstacles. One evening, Jack slammed his journal shut, anger flaring. What's the point? Writing this crap doesn't change what I did, what I saw. Maggie didn't flinch. She met his eyes, calm but firm. It's not about changing the past, Jack. It's about changing how it lives inside you. Her words struck him like a bell. He sat back, rubbing his face, and whispered, I don't know if I can. Then let's not do it alone, Maggie said simply. We'll carry it together. That night when he lay awake, Jack realized something. The desert had once been his fortress, a place to hide from the world. Now with Maggie, it was becoming a place of release, where old burdens could be set down, one breath at a time. The desert was alive with silence, but life inside Jack and Maggie's little world was slowly filling with a new rhythm. Their mornings still began with sitting meditation, sometimes only 10 minutes, sometimes longer when the air was cool and forgiving. But as days passed, they realized mindfulness did not end when the bell of silence faded. It followed them into the simple, ordinary tasks of survival. Maggie noticed it first while cooking. She had grown used to rushing through meals, treating food as fuel between long hours of ranch work. But one evening, she set the kettle on the small propane stove and paused. She watched the steam rise, felt the warmth on her face, and smiled. When Jack walked in, she handed him a piece of bread and said, Let's eat slowly tonight. Really taste it. Jack smirked. It's just bread. Exactly, Maggie replied. That's why it matters. If we can find joy in something as simple as bread, maybe life won't feel so heavy. They sat across from each other, tearing small pieces of bread, chewing carefully, noticing texture, warmth, and taste. Jack found himself surprised. The bread was the same as always, but something about eating with full attention made it feel different, almost sacred. Scout sat nearby, head tilted, watching them with canine curiosity. Maggie laughed and tossed him a piece. Even Scout can practice mindful eating, she teased. Walking meditation also became part of their routine. Each morning, after coffee, they set out across the sand, Scout leading the way. At first, Jack still scanned the horizon like a soldier, instincts hard to break. But gradually, Maggie's calm presence slowed him down. They walked in silence, step after step, Maggie whispering the phrases she had learned. "I have arrived. I am home." Jack tried them too, clumsily at first, but then with more conviction. For the first time, the desert no longer felt like an enemy landscape. It felt like ground beneath his feet, steady and real. Work on the ranch became another practice. When Maggie repaired fences or fed the cattle, she did so with slow, deliberate care. Jack joined her, realizing that even hammering a nail or hauling water could be an act of mindfulness. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, he paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Never thought mending a fence could feel like meditation," he said. Maggie smiled. "Life is meditation, if you let it be." But challenges remained. In town, Jack still tensed up at the sound of trucks backfiring or at crowded grocery aisles. Once in the hardware store, he froze when a shelf collapsed nearby. His heart pounded, adrenaline flooding his veins. Maggie guided him outside, placed her hand on his chest, and whispered, "Breathe with me. In, out." Slowly the panic ebbed. Jack leaned against the truck, embarrassed. "I'm supposed to be stronger than this," he muttered. Maggie shook her head gently. "Strength isn't never falling apart. It's learning how to come back." That night he wrote in his journal, "Panicked in town, but I came back. Maybe that's enough." Their journals became more than private reflections. They became letters to each other. Sometimes Maggie left hers open for Jack to read, and he did the same. One evening she found his entry, watched her laugh while fixing the fence today, felt peace I never thought I'd feel again. Her eyes misted. For years, Maggie had lived with sorrow, her joy muted. Now joy was returning, not by chasing happiness, but by slowing down enough to notice it. Scout, as always, was their silent companion. His presence reminded them of simple being. When they practiced mindful breathing, his steady rise and fall of breath was like a living metronome. When they laughed, he barked joyfully, wagging his tail, pulling them further into the present moment. By autumn, their desert home had changed in subtle ways. The container still bore rust, the winds still howled, but inside there was warmth, softness. Maggie had placed a small wooden table in one corner, with a candle, a bell, and the book that had started it all. It was their meditation corner. Each evening they sat there, not as two broken souls, but as companions walking a shared path. One night, after their practice, Jack whispered, "You know what's strange? The more I sit with the silence, the less it feels like silence. It's alive, like it's listening." Maggie squeezed his hand. "Maybe it's not silence anymore. Maybe it's us finally being present." And so, their days unfolded, simple, quiet, yet profoundly different. The desert no longer felt empty. Each breath, each step, each shared glance was filled with meaning. For Jack, who had lived so long with ghosts of the past, and for Maggie, who had lived so long in grief, everyday life was slowly transforming into practice, and practice into peace. The idea of leaving Nevada, even for a few days, unsettled Jack. For years, the desert had been his fortress, a place where the outside world could not intrude. Yet Maggie insisted, "Sometimes we need to step out to grow." She had read in the local paper about a Dharma talk in California, hosted by a community of monks and lay practitioners following Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings. "It's not far," she said, and maybe we'll learn something beyond the book." Reluctantly, Jack agreed. He trusted Maggie's instincts, and deep down, he knew that while the desert gave him silence, it could not give him everything. They drove west in Maggie's old pickup, Scout curled comfortably in the back seat. The journey carried them through stretches of barren land that gradually gave way to greener valleys. For Jack, each mile from home was a test. Crowds, noise, unexpected sounds, these were triggers. But Maggie kept him anchored, reminding him to breathe, to notice the wind on his skin, the sound of Scout's steady breathing, the rhythm of the road. By the time they reached the small meditation center tucked among California hills, Jack felt wary but strangely calmer than he had expected. The center was simple, wooden buildings surrounded by gardens, wind chimes stirring softly in the breeze. People moved quietly, smiling gently as they greeted one another. Jack stiffened, unused to such open warmth. But no one pressed him, no one demanded stories or explanations. They simply bowed slightly and continued their way. It was disarming in its gentleness. The Dharma talk was held in a modest hall, sunlight streaming through open windows. Cushions lined the floor, and the scent of incense hung faintly in the air. Jack and Maggie found a place near the back, Scout lying obediently at their feet. Then a young monk stepped forward. He could not have been more than 30, his head shaved, his robe the color of warm earth. His face carried a serenity that startled Jack. It was not emptiness but presence, as if he belonged completely in that moment. When the monk began to speak, his voice was soft but resonant. "Suffering is not an enemy," he said. "It is a teacher. We do not run from it, nor do we drown in it. We hold it gently, like a crying child. When we hold our suffering, we begin to understand it, and in understanding, it transforms." Jack felt a shiver run through him. The monk's words pierced something he had buried deep, the belief that suffering must either be fought or ignored. But here was another way, to hold it, to sit with it. He remembered Maggie's hand on his arm, her whispered reminder during meditation, just notice it. Perhaps she had been pointing him here all along. The monk continued, telling stories of refugees, of veterans, of people who had carried unbearable burdens, yet found peace through mindfulness and compassion. "The past is a river," he said. "We cannot stop its flow, but we can learn how to sail upon it." Jack's throat tightened. He thought of his journal entries, of nights spent fighting against the river of memory. Could he really learn to sail? After the talk, participants shared a silent meal. Bowls of rice, vegetables, and tea were placed gently before them. The community ate slowly, each bite taken with full awareness. Jack, who had often devoured food like rations, found the practice disarming. He watched the monk chew carefully, eyes soft, as if each grain of rice mattered. For the first time, Jack tried it himself. Maggie smiled at him across the table, and in her eyes he saw encouragement, pride, and love. Later, Maggie approached the young monk, her voice hesitant. "Your words, they helped us. We've been reading Thich Nhat Hanh, practicing at home, but sometimes we feel lost." The monk bowed slightly. "Lost is a good place to begin, because when we admit we are lost, we can begin to truly look." His gaze shifted to Jack, calm but penetrating. "Your suffering is deep, but so is your capacity to heal. Do not run from it. Walk with it. Breathe with it. In time, it will teach you." Jack swallowed, unable to speak. The monk's words were not dramatic, but they landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through him. For the first time in years, he felt not judged, not pitied, but understood. That night, back at the small motel near the center, Jack lay awake. Maggie slept beside him, Scout curled at the foot of the bed. Jack stared at the ceiling, the monk's words echoing in his mind. Hold your suffering like a child. He closed his eyes, imagining the faces of his fallen brothers, the explosions, the chaos. Instead of shoving them away, he tried, awkwardly, painfully, to hold them. His breath came ragged, tears sliding down his face, but he kept breathing, and for a fleeting moment, the images softened. They did not vanish, but they felt less like enemies, more like memories he could carry without drowning. The next morning, Jack told Maggie, voice rough, "I think I understand now. We don't have to bury the pain. We can walk with it, together." Maggie smiled, tears bright in her eyes. "That's all I've ever wanted." When they returned to Nevada, the desert felt different. The silence no longer seemed empty. It felt alive, humming with possibility. Their journey had only begun, but now they knew they were not walking it alone. They carried the teachings, the monk's presence, and each other, and step by step, breath by breath, they were learning to let the desert and life itself become their teacher. The Nevada desert welcomed them home with its usual stark silence, a silence that once had weighed heavy on Jack Turner's chest, but now felt a little less oppressive. After their trip to California and the profound words of the young monk, both Jack and Maggie Hart sensed that their lives had turned a corner. The container, the ranch, the endless stretches of sagebrush, they no longer seemed like a prison. They had become a practice ground. Every morning they still rose before dawn. Maggie would light the small candle in their meditation corner, and Jack would set out 2 cushions on the floor. Scout, ever faithful, would plop down between them, yawning as if to say, again. Then they would sit in silence, following their breath, letting the desert itself breathe with them. But Jack was restless. He was grateful for the gentleness of Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings, yet a part of him yearned for something more raw, more direct. He carried scars not only on his skin, but etched into the architecture of his mind. The nightmares of gunfire and the weight of dead comrades did not yield easily to soft breaths alone. He felt he needed a practice that would allow him not just to calm the storms, but to walk straight into them. One night, as Maggie read aloud from the book, Jack interrupted. "This is good, this peace, this smiling, but what about the darker stuff? What about the shadows that won't leave? I heard once, when I was deployed, about Tibetan monks, about practices where they face demons head-on instead of trying to make them disappear. Do you think that could work for someone like me?" Maggie tilted her head. She had never studied beyond the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, but she understood Jack's need. "Maybe," she said carefully. "If it's another doorway, maybe we should open it." Weeks later, while in Reno for supplies, Jack wandered into a dusty used bookstore. Tucked between travel guides and New Age paperbacks, he found a weathered volume titled The Heart of Vajrayana, an introduction to Tibetan Tantra. Its pages described practices foreign, yet strangely familiar, visualizing fierce deities, chanting mantras, using the very energy of fear and desire as fuel for awakening. He brought the book home, and that evening showed it to Maggie. "It's different," he warned. "Not just gentle breathing. It's intense, symbolic. They use images of demons, wrathful gods. The idea is you don't hide from your fear. You invite it to tea." Maggie read a passage silently, then smiled faintly. "It sounds terrifying, but maybe that's what makes it powerful." Together they tried a simple exercise from the book. They sat cross-legged on their cushions, candle flickering between them. Jack closed his eyes, calling forth the familiar surge of terror, the flash of an IED, the cries of his brothers in arms. Normally he would force the images away. Tonight, he did something different. He pictured them sitting in front of him, dark, heavy, breathing. His pulse quickened, sweat beaded on his forehead, but instead of running, he whispered, "I see you. Sit down with me." Maggie did the same. In her inner vision, Amy appeared, 16 again, smiling in the way she had before, that night in 1978. Tears spilled down Maggie's face, but instead of recoiling, she breathed deeply. "You're here," she whispered. "I miss you, but I will not turn away." When they opened their eyes, both were crying. Scout whined softly, pressing against Jack's knee. Jack wiped his face, trembling but strangely lighter. It felt like I was finally brave enough to look straight at it. In the days that followed, they alternated their practices, mornings with the gentleness of mindful breathing and walking meditation, evenings with the raw intensity of Vajrayana visualizations. Sometimes Maggie read from Thich Nhat Hanh. Other nights, Jack recited mantras he had learned from the Tibetan text. The two traditions, one soft as water, one fierce as fire, began to weave together in their desert home. Scout was always there, a grounding presence. Jack joked one evening, maybe he's a Dharmapala, one of those protector spirits they talk about. Maggie laughed, tousling Scout's fur. If that's true, he's the friendliest, wrathful deity I've ever met. The practices changed Jack. He no longer avoided his nightmares. When they came, he tried to sit up, breathe, and even imagine holding the chaos in his arms the way the monk had instructed, like a child crying for attention. The nights were still hard, but they were no longer battles he always lost. Maggie, too, found herself softening toward Amy's memory. The locket no longer represented only pain. Some nights, she placed it on the meditation altar beside the candle, a symbol not of loss, but of presence. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Jack turned to Maggie. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with a strange clarity. "I think this is what I needed, not just peace, but the strength to walk into the fire and not burn, to face what I've been running from all these years." Maggie squeezed his hand, her own eyes moist. "Then that's the path we'll walk, together." Outside, the desert wind howled, carrying sand across the dark expanse. The stars above Nevada glittered like watchful eyes. For Jack, silence was no longer a mirror reflecting only ghosts. It had become a doorway, into breath, into memory, into mystery, and perhaps, beyond the ordinary stillness of Zen, into the fierce embrace of Tibetan Tantra, where even demons could become teachers. That night, as they drifted into sleep, Maggie whispered, "Whatever path this is, it's ours." Jack, half asleep, murmured back, "Ours and Scout's." The dog thumped his tail once against the floor, as if to seal the vow. The storm came without warning, not outside in the desert, but inside Jack's mind. It began with a night like any other. The candle in their meditation corner burned low. Maggie had read aloud from the Tibetan text, then closed her eyes to practice silent breathing. Jack sat beside her, trying to steady his thoughts, yet something felt different, an unease rippling beneath the surface. When they finally lay down, Scout curling at their feet, Jack hoped sleep would come. But sleep brought fire. He found himself back in the Middle East, dust in the air, the metallic taste of adrenaline in his mouth. The Humvee ahead of him burst into flames, the blast throwing bodies into the air. He heard screaming, saw faces twisted in agony, Faces he knew, his brothers, his family. He reached for them, but his hands were covered in blood. The scene shifted. He was dragging a lifeless body through sand. Then another and another. Their eyes stared up at him, hollow, accusing. Jack jerked awake, chest heaving, drenched in sweat. The container was dark, but the images still burned behind his eyelids. His first instinct was to bolt outside, to pace, to escape. But then, through the ringing in his ears, he remembered the monk's words, "Hold your suffering like a crying child." And the Tibetan teaching, "The demon you fear most can become your teacher if you invite it in." His fists clenched, his body trembled, but he forced himself to sit up. "Not tonight," he whispered to himself. "I won't run." Maggie stirred beside him. "Jack?" Her voice was soft, worried. "Nightmare," he rasped. "Stay with me." She sat up immediately, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Breathe, in and out. I'm here." Jack closed his eyes again, but this time not to escape, this time to face it. He summoned the images deliberately, the burning vehicles, the cries, the lifeless eyes. His stomach knotted, his chest burned, but instead of fighting them, he pictured them sitting in front of him, like dark figures in a circle. His breath grew ragged. He whispered the mantra he had read from the Vajrayana text, Om Mani Padme Hum, over and over, the syllables vibrating in his chest, grounding him. In his mind's eye, the figures did not vanish, but their edges softened. He imagined holding them, one by one, like wounded children. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I see you, I carry you, but you don't have to destroy me anymore." Tears streamed down his face. Maggie held his hand tightly, her other hand over her own heart. "You're not alone," she murmured. "I'm right here." Scout had woken, pressing close against Jack's leg, his warm body steady and protective. Jack felt it, the unconditional presence of the dog, the unwavering love of Maggie, the silent strength of the practices they had learned. The nightmare did not disappear, but for the first time, Jack was not its prisoner. He was its witness. Minutes, maybe hours, passed. When Jack finally opened his eyes, the candle had burned down to a stub. The desert outside was silent, the stars cold and bright. His body shook with exhaustion, but inside, something was different. He had looked directly into the abyss and had not been devoured. Maggie stroked his hair gently. "You faced it," she whispered. Jack's voice cracked. "I thought, if I faced it, it would kill me. But it didn't. It's still here, but smaller somehow, like a storm that finally passed." She kissed his forehead. "That's because you didn't fight it. You embraced it. That's real courage." He let out a shaky laugh, wet with tears. Maybe the monk was right. Maybe suffering really is a teacher. He looked at her, then at Scout, then at the candle. And maybe we're finally learning how to listen. That night, for the first time in years, Jack drifted back into sleep, not as a soldier haunted by ghosts, but as a man who had dared to sit in the fire of his own pain and breathe. The demons were still there, but they had lost their teeth, and deep within, a seed of compassion had begun to grow, not just for others, but for himself. The desert was quiet, but the quiet no longer pressed on Jack like a coffin. It breathed with him. Each morning, he arose with Maggie and Scout, the three of them stepping into the new rhythm they had created together. Meditation, chores, silence, laughter. For the first time, silence felt alive. One morning, Maggie set down a weathered book on their small wooden table, Peace is Every Step, by Thich Nhat Hanh. The cover was faded, corners curled. "I read this years ago," she said softly. "I think we're ready now." Jack traced the title with his calloused finger. He opened to a page and read aloud, "Breathing in, I calm body and mind. Breathing out, I smile. Dwelling in the present moment, I know this is a wonderful moment." He let out a low laugh. Simple words, but not simple to live. "Maybe that's the point," Maggie replied. From then on, their mornings included these practices, simple but powerful. Walking meditation along the sandy ridges, every step deliberate. Scout trotting beside them, pausing when they paused, sensing the rhythm. Maggie's face would soften in the morning light, and Jack found that even the act of watching her breathe made him calmer. As weeks passed, their container home began to change. Maggie suggested they create a meditation corner. Together they built a small altar, a rough-hewn wooden shelf Jack carved himself, upon which they placed a candle, a small bowl of water, a simple rock from the desert, and later a clay statue Maggie bought in a roadside market of a serene Buddha figure. It wasn't about religion to Jack, not yet, but about intention, a space to remind them of presence. Evenings found them there. Sometimes they chanted softly, Jack stumbling at first over the syllables of Om Mani Padme Hum, but slowly the sound began to feel like a heartbeat, echoing through the container's steel walls. Maggie would close her eyes, her lips moving silently. Scout lay curled beside them, his breathing steady, grounding. But the greatest transformation was in Jack's heart. He began to feel something he hadn't in years, compassion for others. It started small. One morning, while driving into town for supplies, he noticed an old man struggling to carry heavy bags. Jack pulled over and helped, the man nodding in thanks. The gesture was ordinary, but it struck Jack deeply. In helping another, he had felt lighter himself. He told Maggie later. She smiled knowingly. "That's what he means," she said, pointing to the book. "Peace isn't just in our breath. It's in how we live with others." Jack began to see it everywhere, in the way Maggie cooked simple meals with care, in the way Scout guarded him, wordless but devoted, even in the harsh desert wind that stripped him bare but reminded him he was still alive. One evening, as they watched the desert sky turn violet with dusk, Jack turned to Maggie. "I think I've been afraid of love," he admitted. "Afraid that if I let myself care, I'd lose it, like in the war, like with my brothers." Maggie took his hand, rough and scarred, into hers. "Love isn't about holding on, Jack. It's about showing up, day by day." He squeezed her hand tightly, tears stinging his eyes. For the first time, he allowed himself not just to lean on Maggie, but to trust the bond forming between them. It wasn't fragile. It was alive. In the weeks that followed, they began journaling after meditation. Jack's entries were raw, fragments of memory, flashes of grief, but also small notes of gratitude. Maggie wrote about resilience, about the desert's stark beauty, about Jack's quiet strength. Sometimes they shared, sometimes they kept it private. The act itself was healing. One night, Maggie read aloud a passage from a Tibetan text. "When the heart expands, it becomes vast as the sky. No suffering can fill it, and every joy can rest within it." Jack closed his eyes, listening. He imagined his chest, once locked in armor, slowly opening, vast as the Nevada sky above them. Scout stirred, lifting his head. His amber eyes glowed in the lantern light. Jack reached down, scratching behind his ears. "Guess you've been teaching me that all along, huh, boy?" The dog's tail thumped softly, as if in agreement. For Jack, expanding the heart was not just an idea anymore. It was a practice. Every breath, Every step, every act of kindness became part of the path. And with Maggie by his side, the journey no longer felt solitary. The war still haunted him, the memories still came, but they no longer owned him. Instead, they were teachers, reminding him that out of darkness, compassion could grow. That night, lying beside Maggie, listening to Scout's steady breathing, Jack whispered a prayer, not to any god, but to life itself. May I keep opening, may I keep learning, may I never close my heart again. For months, Jack and Maggie had practiced alone in the Nevada desert, their container turned home, glowing softly each night, with the light of a single candle. Their life had become rhythm, breath, silence, compassion, but the teachings they read again and again all pointed to something larger. Sangha, community. One evening, as they sat cross-legged by their small altar, Maggie closed the book in her lap. "We've come far, Jack, but every path I read about says the same thing. You can't walk it alone. We need a Sangha." Jack shifted uncomfortably. The idea of people still made him wary. In town, he barely spoke, but he could feel the truth in Maggie's words. His nightmares were quieter now, but the war still echoed. Maybe it was time to sit with others, people who understood silence the way he was learning to. Through a contact Ruth had mentioned months earlier, Maggie found a small Buddhist community an hour's drive from their desert home in the outskirts of Reno. It was not a temple of marble or gold, but a converted barn on a quiet property, the wood polished by decades of use. Outside, colorful prayer flags fluttered gently in the breeze. When Jack, Maggie, and Scout arrived, Jack's chest tightened. Cars lined the gravel path. Voices drifted from the barn, low, calm, yet unfamiliar. Scout seemed to sense Jack's tension, pressing close against his leg as if to reassure him. Inside, the space was simple, cushions arranged in a circle. At the front sat an elderly monk in maroon robes, his head shaven, his presence serene. His name was Lama Tenzin Dorje, a Tibetan refugee who had lived in America for 30 years. His lined face carried both suffering and peace, and when his eyes lifted to Jack and Maggie, it was as though he saw through their armor and straight into their hearts. "Welcome," Lama Tenzin said softly. "You've come far." Maggie bowed respectfully. Jack hesitated, then gave a stiff nod. The Sangha members, a mixture of young and old, greeted them with warm but quiet smiles. There was no interrogation, no nod for stories, only space. They began with chanting. Jack stumbled at first, the foreign syllables sticking in his throat. But then he remembered the mantra he had whispered in his nightmares, and the vibration settled into him. Maggie's voice, gentle and steady, wove beside his. Scout lay curled by the door, his ears flicking, but his body relaxed. Later, Lama Tenzin gave a short talk. His voice was like water flowing over stone. "We carry our wounds like heavy stones in a sack. Alone, the burden crushes us. But together we learn to share the load. The Sangha is not perfect. It is human. But it is a mirror that shows us both our darkness and our light." Jack felt the words pierce him. He looked around the circle. Ordinary people, some scarred, some smiling, all sitting with their own silent battles. For the first time he realized he was not unique in his suffering. He was part of something larger. During walking meditation, Maggie walked beside him, their steps slow, deliberate. Jack felt the gravel under his feet, the Nevada air cool on his face, Scout's leash loose in his hand. Each step was an act of grounding. Afterwards, the community shared tea and simple bread. One man, around Jack's age, introduced himself as David, an Iraq War veteran. His face bore the same haunted lines Jack knew from his own mirror. They exchanged only a few words, but the connection was immediate, a recognition of shared ghosts. On the drive home, the desert stretched wide and silver under the moonlight. Maggie placed her hand over Jack's on the gear shift. "So?" she asked quietly. Jack exhaled, his throat tight. "It's strange, but good strange. I think I needed to see I wasn't alone." She smiled, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "That's Sangha." In the weeks that followed, they returned again and again. Jack began to sit longer, chant louder, share small fragments of his story with the group. He listened, too, to the young woman who had survived cancer, to the father grieving a lost child, to the old woman who spoke of loneliness softened by practice. Each story was a mirror, and each mirror reflected not despair but resilience. Back in their desert home, their practice deepened. They meditated not just for themselves, but for others. Maggie whispered prayers for her cousin Amy, lost to the stars. Jack prayed for his fallen brothers, for every soldier who still carried invisible wounds. One night, Jack turned to Maggie as they sat by the candle. "I think I'm starting to understand. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about carrying it differently, lighter." Maggie's eyes filled with quiet pride. "That's because you're not carrying it alone anymore." Scout shifted, resting his head on Jack's knee. Jack scratched behind his ears, smiling faintly. "Guess I never really was." The desert had a way of stripping life down to its essence. No distractions, no noise, only space, silence, and truth. For Jack and Maggie, that silence had once been unbearable. Now it was a teacher. Months had passed since they joined the Sangha in Reno. Each week, they sat with Lama Tenzin and the others, and each week, Jack felt his armor grow lighter. He had learned not only to sit with his suffering, but to transform it, to cradle it in compassion. Maggie, steady as ever, walked beside him, her quiet strength balancing his fiery storms. One evening, after returning from the Sangha, Jack placed the old book by Thich Nhat Hanh back on their altar. He lit a fresh candle, then turned to Maggie. "This isn't just about surviving anymore," he said. "It's about living, really living. And I want us to walk this path together, not just here, but in everything we do." Maggie's eyes softened, tears glistening. "Then let's commit, not just to each other, but to the path." They began weaving Buddhist principles into daily life. When disagreements arose, instead of anger, they practiced deep listening, pausing to breathe before speaking. Meals became mindful rituals, each bite an offering of gratitude. They dedicated their meditations not only to their own healing, but to friends, strangers, even enemies. Jack whispered prayers for soldiers on both sides of wars he once fought, an act he could never have imagined before. Scout remained their silent witness, padding beside them during walking meditation, curling close at night. To Jack, the dog became a living bodhisattva, a being of pure presence, teaching loyalty without words. As the seasons shifted, Jack and Maggie built a small meditation hut beside the container, a space open to anyone seeking refuge. Slowly, curious neighbors and even members of the Sangha came to visit. The desert, once a place of isolation, became a sanctuary of community. One evening, Lama Tenzin himself visited. Sitting cross-legged on the earthen floor, he looked at Jack and Maggie with a gentle smile. "You have walked far," he said, "but remember, the path is not a finish line. It is each breath, each step. To embrace it is to live it, fully, here and now." Jack bowed deeply. For once it was not out of duty, but gratitude. That night, lying under the desert stars, Maggie rested her head on Jack's chest. "Do you still hear the ghosts?" she asked softly. Jack inhaled, listening to the vast silence. Yes, he said honestly, but they don't own me anymore. They walk beside me, and maybe they're guiding me too. Maggie smiled, pressing closer. Then we're exactly where we're meant to be. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush. Scout shifted, sighing contentedly. Above them, the stars stretched infinite, a reminder of both mystery and belonging. Jack closed his eyes, holding Maggie, feeling Scout's warmth, breathing into the silence that had once been a prison, but was now a refuge. For the first time, he felt not just healed, but whole. The war had shaped him, the pain had scarred him, but the Dharma had taught him how to live with open hands, not clenched fists. With Maggie beside him, he no longer feared the future. They had embraced the path, and the path, vast as the Nevada sky, embraced them in return. If this story touched you, if you felt the silence of the Nevada desert or the echoes of Jack's journey toward healing, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and follow us for more stories that dig beneath the surface and search for truth, love, and meaning. Every click of support keeps these stories alive, and we promise the next journey will take you even further.